there. Welcome. Now, contrary to popular belief, you have not just stumbled upon an episode of the MTV reality series Cribs, which I am now realizing is a cultural reference far too old for most of you. No, indeed, I am Miss Bell, and I will be your host for the next week's lectures, entitled Bell Tells. That is the name that Miss Guensche believes I should give this lecture series, although I'm open to suggestions. I'm not sold on that one. I think it could do some work. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Miss Bell, we hardly recognized you. You look so collegiate and professional. There are two factors influencing this. Number one, the presence of these incredibly academic-looking glasses on my face. Number two, the Alumni Association mug given to me by my university to prove that I do, in fact, possess a college degree. Now, all that being said, I'm going to go through today's lecture just like in class, except I won't pause for your questions, and I'll go faster than we normally do because you have the ability to pause me and replay anything I say. I know I speak for all of us when I say that's a dream we've been long in realizing. Shall we get started? I was hoping you'd ask. Alright, this is titled Lecture 7.13, The Arrival of the New Deal. Where we last left off, the American economy had gone to crap. FDR has taken office. We're going to see what the man tries to do about the Great Depression, although the success that he meets with is mixed at best. As soon as Roosevelt takes office, he uses the new medium of radio to immediately connect with millions of Americans across the country. He begins hosting what he calls fireside chats. The name derives from the idea that you keep your radio near the fireside in the evening, you and your family gather around, you snuggle down with a cup of hot cocoa, and you listen to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt speaking through your radio to you individually. Much like we would call these fireside chats, except I live in an apartment, so I don't have a fireplace, children. Regardless, this made him a visible or a tangible presence in people's lives. This is also the beginning of, it's going to be television towards the end of his time in the presidency. We're going to see him create news bulletins sometimes. He will be a much more present president than the country has seen before. It made Americans feel like they had a personal relationship with Roosevelt, and that made them feel reassured, because a lot of what was going on in the Great Depression was just fear and uncertainty. And one thing that Roosevelt was very good at was reassuring people. He famously gave a speech where he asserted, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so he had this kind of calming presence for a majority of Americans. He had a plan, he could express the plan well, and it made people feel like the country was going to get better. We also will see, during the decade of the Great Depression, we will see that FDR uses this economic emergency to expand the powers of the presidency in ways that no other president had done before, in ways that Wilson sought to, and maybe Teddy Roosevelt sought to, but they never had the ability to take it quite as far as FDR could. This is when we talked about in civics, where Stephen brought up the idea that FDR had signed over 3,700 executive orders, just uses of presidential power without really congressional checkups. That's one of the things that we're seeing during this era. He comes up with a program, a series of initiatives that he believes is going to end the Great Depression. He calls these the New Deal. That's a very important term for you to know. It's a very important economic moment in United States policy. He's kind of basing it on the phrase the square deal, which is something that Teddy Roosevelt campaigned on. We're going to make sure that the economy is set up to give every American a square deal. Well, Roosevelt has taken that and created the New Deal. So he's trying to like draw in this mystique that kind of goes with the first Roosevelt administration and compare himself to Teddy Roosevelt. And so he does what we will see, or we have seen, has been kind of typical for progressive presidents. He is really stuck on the idea of experts leading things. And so he creates a lot of panels and a lot of committees that have experts, enlightened statesman-type individuals filling government jobs, these intellectuals who were functioning as administrators, to handle parts of the government that progressives like FDR thought average people who had not been trained for government for most of their lives were not capable of doing. So, additionally, interesting to note, that the 1932 presidential election had also given the Democrats a majority in both houses of Congress, in the Senate as well as the House of Representatives. So we are going to see Democrats kind of have a blank check, or at least FDR himself have a blank check for the things he wants to accomplish during his first term in office, because there's not any significant Republican opposition to speak of. We're going to see that the only group in government that even tries to stand in FDR's way is the Supreme Court, and he deals with them swiftly and mercilessly, except they deal with him right back, and it turns into a moment, if you will. Alright, so the first months of FDR's administration were just a frantic whirlwind of activity. He was passing things left and right, pushing legislation through Congress, issuing executive orders, and during his first 100 days, which is a time period that most presidents are kind of judged on, at the end of a president's first 100 days in office, they'll always kind of take a moment, the media, other politicians, to reflect on what the president has accomplished in that first 100 days. They did it about this time last year, actually with President Trump. Roosevelt's first 100 days in office were straight crazy because he couldn't be stopped. Didn't want to be stopped. Hashtag can't stop, won't stop, was just going, gone, as far as things that he was taking on. He was, he passed 15 major bills focusing on things like banking failures, agricultural overproduction. We'll talk about specific agencies that he created for this in a minute. The business slump as far as industry goes, and then rising numbers of unemployment. So when he creates all these agencies, he does it in a very short amount of time, and they all have names that are a mouthful. They're very long to say. So most of the time when we talk about agencies from the New Deal, we're not actually going to refer to them by their full name. They will be called by an abbreviation of their full names. Usually there's abbreviations or acronyms that these entities have. There are so many of them passed in such a small amount of time, and they all have the most jumbled and complicated names and go by such varied acronyms and abbreviations that they are sometimes called alphabet soup programs. And you either have in your possession now, or you will have in your possession at the beginning of next week, a chart that lists for you alphabet soup programs, and you'll kind of get a feel for, oh, this is when they created the SEC and the FDIC and the AAA and the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, a different one, and the NIRA and the NYA and the WPA, and you're just like, but why? Because, kids, the Great Depression makes people do crazy things, like not call anything by its first name. Anyway, so we sometimes talk about New Deal legislation when we're feeling fancy. Other times we will call it alphabet soup programs when we're just trying to relate to the kids and how they talk these days, because I know that's how most of you communicate. Okay, so one of the first issues that he takes on is banking reform. At the time of the Great Depression, banks had failed. The way banking works is banks don't keep all of your cash on hand. The cash that Sydney gives to the bank is then taken to finance a loan that Audrey wants to take from the bank. So they never have enough money in the bank at all times to cover all of the money that every single person who banks there has invested in the bank. Which means if all the people from a given bank were to go to that bank and withdraw all their money at once, or attempt to do so, the bank would fail. The bank would not have enough money to cover all of the withdrawals that people would be trying to make. That happened sometimes at the very beginning of the Great Depression when people were really concerned about the state of banking for understandable reasons, like the stock market had just taken a nosedive into the pavement. People went and tried to withdraw their money from banks. Most of the time they could not get all of the money they had withdrawn, or they sometimes couldn't even get part of it because banks were just broke. So think about that. If you go to the bank, you're like, ah, gosh, I really need cash to pay my rent. And you go try to make a withdrawal, and they're like, sorry, we don't have money for you. The bank's out of money. The panic that you would feel. If you are familiar with the classic Christmas film starring Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed called It's a Wonderful Life, right when they're about to go on their honeymoon, finally George is going to get to leave Bedford Falls for the first time, go somewhere, make something of himself, see the world. There's a run on his savings and loan. Everybody goes to the bank that he and his family are part of, owning, and they try to withdraw their money all at the same time. He doesn't have the money, so he's faced with either letting the bank close and be bought out by the town crony Potter, or using the cash that he and his wife had intended to use for their honeymoon to give all the members of the bank a bit of their withdrawal back. In the film, he gives them the money, and he never goes on his honeymoon, and his life sucks. But actually, it doesn't, because George Bailey is the richest man in that town. Okay. So, in order to address this bank crisis, right, FDR is looking out. The savings of nearly 9 million American families had been affected by bank failures across the country. So, on March 5th, 1933, the day after Franklin Delano Roosevelt has been inaugurated to the presidency, he declares a bank holiday, which sounds fun, doesn't it? Except it's not a fun holiday. It's a forced closure of all banks in the United States. He shuts them down. He uses the word holiday so people don't freak out and are like, wait, why is he shutting the banks down? But he does shut the banks down. And he calls Congress into special session. And while the banks are closed, the next 4 days, Congress passes the Emergency Banking Act, which allows banks to reopen only if a Treasury Department inspection shows that they have sufficient cash reserves on hand to meet their needs. So he closes banks down. And I want you to kind of keep that in mind, as we've already read some FDR in government where we've been talking about his views on the economy and how much the government should be involved in the economy. This is what people are talking about when they talk about how FDR expanded the power of the federal government in the American economy, because it's a big deal for the government to say that all banks, which are privately owned businesses, have to shut down, and they can only reopen when the government has investigated to make sure they have enough money. So that's kind of what we're talking about. Not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but it is an unprecedented thing that FDR did the day after his inauguration. So you want to talk about somebody like getting down to business to defeat the Huns, your boy Franklin. All right. So then he gives his first Sunday night fireside chat, where he assures the American families listening, they had about 60 million in the audience that night listening to the president, he assures them that their money is safe. Then he creates the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which says that the government will insure, the federal government will insure deposits people make in private banks up to $2,500. So if you have invested up to $2,500 in the bank during the Great Depression, and then that bank shuts down and closes, or you go to withdraw the money and the bank doesn't have it, you can get that money from the federal government. What's that? What's that, Aaliyah? Oh, yes. Okay, Aaliyah asks a very good question. This is an excellent point. Does the FDIC still exist? Does it still insure deposits that Americans make? Yes, and yes, although the amount that the federal government will now insure has gone up. So now the U.S. government will cover any deposits you have made in your bank up to $250,000. So times they are a-changing. Things have changed with inflation. It also, this FDIC and the legislation to create it also prohibited banks from doing risky investments with the money that people had deposited there. Then Roosevelt takes America off the gold standard. We had been on it. He takes us off it. He also lowers interest rates, which, if you remember, I know it's been a while, but we did talk about the Fed when Woodrow Wilson created the Federal Reserve. He gave the Federal Reserve and the federal government the power to set interest rates across the country. And we had talked about how if you make interest rates really low and you make the amount that people have to pay back on money that they borrow very low and very manageable to do, it really encourages people to borrow money and encourages people to spend. So that's what FDR does. He lowers interest rates in an effort to encourage people to spend more money. We'll talk a little bit later about the economic theory behind that, but essentially FDR and his economic advisors at the time subscribed to the idea that the best way to get a nation out of a depression is to spend more, to spend their way out. And so that's what we're going to see him do. The government needs to be spending more, and people need to be spending more in order for the economy to recover. There is a brief glimmer of hope where the economy kind of has a brief bounce back, but then things get bad again, and he's going to continue passing more legislation to try and address this. Moving on to agriculture/manufacturing. Now, one thing that's weird, frankly, just straight weird to talk about, is what was happening with the United States agricultural sector during the Great Depression. Because all farmers were actually overproducing. So farms in the United States were actually making more than we knew what to do with. Which is crazy because in a lot of parts of this country it was still the Dust Bowl. But the rest of the country, even like the parts in the Midwest and in the California where farmers were not affected by the Dust Bowl as badly, were just killing it on the agricultural front. They were growing more than anybody knew what to do with. And that's a good thing, but it's also, at least Roosevelt saw it as a bad thing, because what that means is that the prices to buy wheat or corn or cows, all those prices stay really low because there's lots of corn, there's lots of wheat, there's lots of cows. And so you can't really make a living. You can't really have a strong agricultural economy if the prices for those products are really low. At the same time, the industrial sector, all of our factories, were really underproducing. We were not making nearly enough in the industrial sector, and so FDR wanted to balance things out. And he's going to balance things out in a way that is a little bit sad for most people who were farmers at the time. So he creates the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. This is not a AAA battery. This is not AAA, the insurance company, the car company. This is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And what it does is it regulates, it's government regulation of farming economies for the first time, where the government just steps in and says, hey farmers, this is what you're going to grow, this is what you're not going to grow, this is what you're going to do with the extra that you did grow. So the AAA provides cash subsidies to farmers who cut production of wheat, cotton, corn, rice, tobacco, hogs. You don't really produce hogs, but breeding of hogs, and dairy products. Here's what a subsidy is. It is when the government pays you not to do something, or the government pays you to grow something else. So the government would essentially say, hey, we know that you've got 100 acres. You're using all of those 100 acres to grow corn. We will pay you to only grow 50 acres worth of corn. We don't need you to grow anything else, so we will pay you to let 50 acres of your land sit useless. The reason they would do this is because if you're growing less corn, the corn prices go up, and that's a more stable foundation for a farming economy than low corn prices. So what we see during the Great Depression, it's a little bit hard to maybe wrap our minds around, is the federal government paying farms not to produce things, paying farms not to grow wheat, or not to raise pigs, or not to raise cows, or whatever the case may be, because they wanted those prices to go back up. The difficulty is there were a lot of people going hungry during the Great Depression, and so there was a lot of food that was being wasted. There are some accounts, some really heartbreaking accounts of like farmers going and instead of selling their cows, just killing all of them, or instead of selling milk, because the government has subsidized them not to produce dairy products, they're pouring it out on the street in a time when people are going hungry. So it raised questions about efficiency. Like, is this really, that seems like a wasteful thing to be doing in the middle of a Great Depression when people are hungry. Should we be destroying their food? I don't know. But most of the time these subsidies went to owners of large and medium-sized farms who had a lot of land that they were growing on anyway, and usually the way they would cut production is they would stop renting land to tenant farmers or sharecroppers. So the farmers that ended up being hurt the most by subsidies were little farms that didn't have a lot of land to give up to begin with, or were previously sharecropping on a bigger plot of land and then had to stop because that bigger farmer, big business farmer, had to cut his production as well. As far as manufacturing goes, as far as like factories and technological industries, the New Deal sets up the National Recovery Administration, which is the other NRA, and it opens different self-governing associations in 600 different industries, from things all the way from coal to cotton production to steel, and the NRA regulates these industries by setting prices, telling them how much they can charge, and production quotas, how much they're going to have to create. Again, we're seeing like larger businesses kind of benefited from this at the expense of perhaps the smaller enterprises. Again, these pieces of legislation had some regional positive effects, but overall they did not end the Depression, which is going to be kind of a theme we keep coming back to with FDR. Unemployment relief, we'll move on. In May of 1993, wrong decade. In May of 1933, Congress establishes the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA, which just is unemployment aid for millions of unemployed Americans. But the New Deal also kind of wanted to foster an American sense of individualism and independence. Particularly in the 1930s, people had a thing about taking handouts. They didn't like doing it. They thought it was shameful, were not in favor of. So the New Deal eventually puts people to work by creating the Public Works Administration, which is a construction program, which is giving unemployment money to people who don't have jobs, but it's also giving them a job. It's a job that would not have needed to be done if the government was not trying to give them unemployment money. So really, it was kind of like the government was coming up with jobs for people to do, just so people could have jobs, so that the government could give them unemployment money without them feeling bad about being given unemployment money. Then, a couple months later, FDR creates the Civil Works Administration, and it's also seeking to put Americans to work. Within 30 days, it has employed 2.6 million Americans, which is fast and a lot. In 1934, which is kind of its peak year, it's providing jobs for 4 million Americans. They're doing things like fixing bridges, building highways, making public buildings. But the CWA was seen as a short-term solution. The goal was not to employ these people forever, just to employ them for a little while. Another alphabet soup program that FDR creates is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was supposed to be a longer-term program. It pays young men, usually young single men, to do reforestation and conservation work. So they are trying to take care of the physical land. It employed about 250,000 young men. Occasionally they build bridges, they build roads, they build trails, and they would do a lot of work and sprucing up, pun intended, in state and national parks. So at this time there's also a housing crisis that was going on in the United States. Millions of Americans were faced with the prospect of losing their homes. The economic expansion of the 1920s was one of the biggest housing bubbles in American history up to that point. We saw kind of a similar thing in 2008 when everybody was buying houses for less than they were worth and then switching them and creating all sorts of nonsense. And there was a similar type movement in the end of the 1920s that was fueled by excessive borrowing. So when in the 1930s, beginning of the 1930s, when home prices fell apart and banks started closing, the homeowners were dragged down with them. So they had put all this money into a house. You've invested all this money in a house, and then suddenly it's not worth anything anymore. So if you were to sell it, you wouldn't make any money back. Or you have bought a house that is worth much more than you could afford to pay. So you're living in a house that's way too expensive for you, and you're originally able to afford it because the bank was just like giving you loan money every 2 seconds. But when the bank runs out of loan money, all of a sudden you're trying to make payments on a $1 million home on a $250,000 income, which is not ideal. So between 1930 and 1932, more than 500,000 Americans lost their homes. In cities like Cleveland and Indianapolis, half of all home owners faced foreclosure. So Congress creates the Home Owners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, and they refinanced home mortgages, meaning if you are in a house that's worth way more than you can afford, how can we renegotiate the payments that you're making each month so that you can afford it somehow? They also create the Federal Housing Administration, which was made in 1934, and it kind of extended government intervention in the housing market and permanently changed the way mortgages are set up in the country. And all of this, everything we've been talking about this whole time, was done in the first 100 days of Franklin's administration as president. He was a busy guy, quite a busy fellow. However, in spite of the best efforts of your boy FDR, the Great Depression continued to not end, which was the exact opposite of what he wanted it to do. We will continue more in our next lecture. Thanks for joining me today. It's been a real treat. Signing out now.